To my wife, Monica. If she starts coughing a lot, she's not signaling me or anything. I just want y'all to know that. Anyway, oftentimes when we're reading through the Bible, we come to a familiar passage. And many times, if it's a real familiar passage to us, we sort of just read right through it and we don't really take our time with it because it's a familiar passage. It says what it has said every other time that we have read it, and all. Passages that this is especially true of shorter passages. Passages that are 5 or 6 verses, and we've read them, and we maybe even have them memorized, and so it just we just sort of skip right through them. Not to mention the fact that passages that are shorter sometimes difficult to get a message out of, even if we read it very carefully. So if we read it very carefully in the past and we got a message, well, then that must be all that it has to say. But in Luke chapter 15, we find a fairly familiar and short passage that has to do with sheep. Luke 15, 1 through 7 tells the parable of the lost sheep. If you want to open up your Bibles to Luke 15, we'll be there in just a few moments. But it's a familiar story. Story about a shepherd. Sheep wanders off. Shepherd goes and gets it. There's a celebration. That's about it, didn't it? Doesn't sound like a whole lot of lessons can be learned, especially since the actual parable is actually only 4 of the 7 verses. So, a 4-verse parable, that's kind of difficult to understand and get a multiple messages and meanings out of. I mean, sure, there's the lesson that Jesus is the shepherd and we're the sheep and we wandered off and he went and found us and things of that nature. And yes, that's a very applicable message and an important message that we get from this parable. But is that all this parable is about? Or is there possibly something different that maybe because we've just sort of skimmed through it so many times and just been happy with that main primary application that we missed something? I think that there is more to it than just that one message. If you would follow along with me as I read Luke 15, 1 through 7. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost.' Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need repentance." I think that if we examine the audience and the story, that we can learn a little bit more about what this parable is really all about, and then apply it in a slightly different way. So let's begin by looking at the audience. Who was Jesus telling this parable to? Well, there were 2 groups in the audience. First, there were the tax collectors and sinners. The tax collectors and the sinners, when you see that, it typically is referencing what we might call the less desirables in society. The people that, well, you tolerate them, but you only tolerate them for so long before you tell them to move on and get away. Tax collectors would be in a high economic class, so you might think, well, why wouldn't people want to be with them and be friends with them because they were rich? Well, they got there through dishonest means. They got there through selling out to the Roman authorities in this particular instance, and collecting taxes for Rome. And by the way, they didn't necessarily just collect taxes for Rome. They had to collect taxes for their salary too. and for whatever else they wanted. And so the Jews really didn't like tax collectors, even though they had a lot of money. They'd gotten it dishonestly. They got it by cheating. Sinners, on the other hand, were in a much lower economic class, but they were equally hated by the Jews, particularly the religious Jews. And don't misunderstand me, it's not a sin to be poor, although certainly some of the Jewish religious leaders might say so. They might tell you, you're poor because you don't live as righteous of a life as I do. And if you lived a more righteous life, then God would bless you with more. That kind of sounds like something that some other people are peddling today in the religious world. But it's not something that Jesus says. It's not a sin to be poor. And God's not punishing you with poverty or anything of that nature. And He won't reward you if you become more righteous. Well, He might, but that's not the guarantee all. The health and wealth prosperity gospel is not true at all. But anyway, these were the ones who needed Jesus, and they knew it. And because they needed Jesus and they knew they needed Jesus, they followed Him. They followed Him, and more than that, they listened to what He had to say. They paid attention and they applied it in their lives. It was a very exciting thing for them, because here was a rabbi, a teacher, who was actually talking to them, who was actually telling them things that they could do in order to have a better life, to be more close to God. So they needed Jesus, and so they followed Jesus. In our language today, we might call these people the unchurched. People who, they know, they believe in God, but they're not real sure about how to worship God. And so maybe they float from church to church looking for something to help them to understand how to worship God. But they're the unchurched. They're the people who they want to follow God. They just need somebody to show them how. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing. The Jews, on the other hand, the Jewish faith had given up on them because they were traitors. Tax collectors were anyway. Sinners were too, because they weren't trying to be as righteous as those religious leaders were. They were unclean. They were all sorts of bad. And so they weren't worth the time of day to other rabbis, to other religious leaders. So the tax collectors and sinners were the first part of the audience. The second part of the audience for this parable was the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, or the scribes. These were the upper crust in society. They had gotten there not like the tax collectors by selling out their brethren, but by, well, we might say they'd gotten there through taking advantage of other people. The Pharisees, the word means separated ones, and that's what they had done. They had separated themselves from others, from people who were not as meticulous in following the law as they were. If you weren't going to do everything within your power to keep exactly every bit of the law, then they didn't want to have anything to do with you. They separated themselves from you. And quite honestly, they never missed a chance to put someone else down. They never did. And there were 613 specific laws in the law of Moses. And then the Pharisees, over the years, had added all kinds of traditions as well. And in some instances, and Jesus calls them on this a lot of times, those traditions took precedence over what the law said. But if you weren't as meticulous and as devoted to following the law and the traditions as they were, then they wouldn't miss a chance to put you down, especially if your name happened to be Jesus of Nazareth. Because despite the fact that he's the only one who ever followed those 613 specific laws perfectly, they thought he wasn't. They didn't like the way that he was doing. They didn't like the fact that he would eat with tax collectors and sinners, because they wouldn't. So that was the Pharisees. The tax collectors or the teachers were experts in the law. I'm sorry, not the tax collectors. The teachers or the scribes were the experts in the law. They were the ones who spent their time copying by hand the law. You ever tried to copy something by hand? It's not the easiest thing in the world, is it? I mean, even now with computers and everything, if you try to type something that you're looking at, you're eventually going to have a little word that's underlined in red, right? And that doesn't mean, well, that's okay. That means you misspelled it or whatever. Well, I had a little bit of experience back in junior high in copying things word for word out of the encyclopedia. That was the internet before there was the internet, for those that didn't know. And it was kind of difficult sometimes. Especially when you copied a word and you were very careful about it, and then you turn in your paper and the teacher says, "What does this word mean?" I don't know. But anyway, these were the people who thought they did not need Jesus. They didn't need Jesus because they thought that they could be good enough to deserve a reward from God. They were the ones who thought they were following the law so perfectly that there was no way that God could not possibly accept them. And in fact, we might even say they wanted justice, not mercy, from God. Anybody here want justice from God? No. We want mercy. Well, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders of the Jews, they thought that they were good enough that they could demand that God be just. Well, that tells you a little bit about who Jesus was speaking to in the audience when he spoke this parable. But let's look a little bit at the story. See if we can learn a little bit more about shepherd and sheep and so forth. First, we start with the shepherd. Now, you need to understand that when Jesus starts this parable, it's immediately a thrashing of the Pharisees. Okay? You know what a thrashing is? He's beating them up. I mean, he is, it would seem, almost purposefully using a word that is going to get their attention and not necessarily in a positive way. You see, in the strict sections of the Jews, the shepherd was despised. There was disdain for the job of a shepherd. You want to know why? Not because they didn't enjoy the fruits of the shepherd's labor in their clothing, etc., but because the shepherd was unable to obey the law as precisely as the Pharisees thought that they should. What parts of the law? Well, things like the hours of prayer. If you're out in a field with the sheep, you don't know what time it is. You don't know if it's time for prayer, and if it is time for prayer and you pray, and the sheep don't know that, and they're off doing their sheep thing and all, and that could lead to trouble if you're not watching them. You couldn't maintain cleanliness like the Pharisees thought that you should if you were a shepherd, because sheep aren't exactly the cleanest of animals in the world. And if you had to, and what about, you're not supposed to have any contact with death or you're unclean. Sheep get attacked by wild animals and so forth, and you got to fight off that animal and maybe even take the sheep out of, possibly a dead sheep out of the mouth of an animal in order to bring it back to prove how it was killed. So, and all, but, bottom line, shepherds could not observe the law like the Pharisees thought that they should observe the law. And so they didn't like Pharisees. Or the Pharisees didn't like the shepherds. They didn't like hearing about shepherds. They surely didn't like a story where the shepherd is the hero. But that's a story that Jesus told. The tools for the job of the shepherd are important. A shepherd would have several specific items. First, he would have a rod. The rod was about 3 to 4 feet long, with a ball about the size of an orange on the end of it. This was for protection up close. If he had approached an animal that had taken a sheep from his flock, he had that rod, and that rod, you think about it, 3 or 4 foot long stick that has a ball the size of an orange, that's going to do some damage. And so that was for protection up close. Then the shepherd also had his staff. Staff is what we typically think of as the shepherd's crook. The long, skinny staff thing that has a little bend in it at the top, so that the shepherd could reach in with that and pull a sheep out of danger. They had a water skin and scrip. Might say a lunchbox and thermos. The water skin was to carry water. The scrip was to carry his lunch. The lunchbox and thermos. And a sling. The sling was for protection from far off. If he saw a wild animal coming toward his sheep, he could take that sling, and they were very proficient in the use of all of these, but especially of the sling. He could take that, and when that animal got within range, he could sling that rock and hit that animal and get the animal to stay away from his flock. I mean, consider David. And David is the consummate shepherd, okay? In 1 Samuel 17, verses 34 through 37, we read about David. He's gone to visit his brothers at the front line of the battle with the Philistines. And Goliath has come out and made his challenge. And David's like, why? Isn't somebody going out there? Let's take care of this. And his brothers are saying, you dumb kid, just be quiet. And David says, no, somebody's got to take him out. And so they take him to King Saul, and Saul looks at him and says, yeah, right. But look what David says to Saul. Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. For he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord will deliver me from the paw of the lion. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. And we know the story, I hope, don't we? We've heard the story once or twice about how David rushed toward Goliath with that sling in hand. And he slung it, and he slung it, and he slung it, and boom, let it go, and he hit Goliath square in the forehead. And how David won that battle. But did you know earlier in that story, David goes to the little brook? And how many stones did he take out of that brook? 5. Now, have you ever thought of why he would take 5? If he's so proficient in using the sling, surely he wouldn't need 5 stones. And he didn't. He took Goliath out with 1 stone, didn't he? So what did he do with the other 4? Well, it wasn't because he was afraid of missing. It's because, traditionally speaking, Goliath had 4 brothers. And he was prepared if Goliath's brothers came after him. In fact, if you look at passages like 2 Samuel 21, 16 through 32, 1 Chronicles 20, verses 4 through 8, and all, it mentions other giants, if you will, that Israel was forced to deal with that were also Philistines. Giants like, let's look at 1 Chronicles 24 through 8. And after this, there arose a war with the Philistines at Gezer. The Sibaki, the Hushathite, struck down Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants, and the Philistines were subdued. So that would be one brother, perhaps. And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhan, the elder son of Jair, struck down Lamai, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam, which that's exactly how Goliath is described when David fights him. Verse 6, and again there was war at Gath. There was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shema, David's brother, struck him down. These were the descendants of the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. David wasn't afraid of missing. He was prepared. And that's a very important message, I think, for us. When we do battle with our Goliath, we have to trust that God is going to help us, and we need to be prepared to be victorious. So anyway, that tells us a little bit about the shepherd, how it would be an insult to the Pharisees just mentioning the word to them and all. And Jesus probably knew that. What about the sheep, though? Sheep are not the brightest of animals. I'm not sure if you knew that or not, but they're not. They will just chomp away at grass and chomp away at grass, and they will chomp away at grass and go right off a cliff if they're not told stop. That's just the level of intelligence that they have. In my career as a minister, I've had the opportunity on a couple of occasions to coach basketball teams for young people. The first time that I coached it was a junior high girls team at the private school where Monica was teaching in San Antonio. And the girls would get the ball, and you could watch them. They would do this. And then they'd start dribbling, just like that. Okay? All right. So I racked my obviously qualified to be a basketball coach brain, and I came up with this idea. I got some of those cheap foam visors, that have a hole in them that you wear them like this, except I had them put them upside down and pull them down to about right here so that they couldn't look down. And I made them dribble in practice with that on. You know what happened when they got into a game? They caught the ball, they put their head down and okay? Well, whatever, But the point is that the sheep are like that. Well, sheep are like junior high girls. Wow. Okay. Where was I going with that? Never mind. Okay. The point is that sheep are just brain dead almost. I mean, they'll walk off a cliff if you aren't watching them. That's why the shepherd and the sheep have such a close relationship. The relationship with the shepherd is very close. In fact, kind of like a pet. The shepherd would be able to call the sheep by name, and the sheep would respond. In fact, there's a story about how during World War II, that a group of soldiers tried to steal a herd of sheep. They were hungry. They saw the sheep. The shepherd maybe was taking a snooze or something. And so they began to herd the sheep off. And the shepherd knew that just by himself he wasn't going to be able to overpower the soldiers that had taken the sheep. Then he had an idea. He let out his peculiar call for his sheep. And you know what happened? The sheep turned around and trampled the soldiers when they came back to their shepherd. That's the type of relationship that a shepherd had with the sheep. It's probably best exemplified in Psalm 23. David writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's the relationship that David had with the Good Shepherd. And you want to know the good news? That's the relationship that you can have with the Good Shepherd as well. Bottom line, the shepherd would be willing to die for the sheep. That's how much the sheep meant to the shepherd. In fact, Jesus highlights that when he says, I'm the good shepherd. I lay down my life for the sheep. I'm not like a hired hand who doesn't care anything about the sheep. When trouble comes, they run away and save themselves. No. He sacrificed his life for his sheep. And that's what a good shepherd would do. At night, the shepherd would lay across the opening to the sheepfold so that there could be nothing that got in or went out without going over his body. Literally, he was the door or the gate for the sheep. Just like Jesus says in John 10, verse 9, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. So, the shepherd and the sheep, very important parts of the story. Something else, though, that's important in the story is the celebration. The celebration, the party that followed when the shepherd found the lost sheep. Often they had what was called communal shepherds, which means that there would be many shepherds that live in a town, in the same town, and maybe they didn't all own all the sheep. They owned all the sheep together, but a few of them would take all the sheep out in the daytime and then bring them back at night, and all. And the shepherd had absolute responsibility for the sheep. If one was ill and it wasn't your sheep, but it was one of the sheep that you had been charged with caring for, then you as a shepherd had to take care of that sheep. If one died, you had to show its fleece to show how it had died so that it could be proven that you weren't negligent in causing its death. If one was lost, you had to go after it and you had to search for it until you could find it. See, what would happen is when they returned for the evening and one shepherd was missing, everyone knew that he was out looking for a lost sheep. And the townspeople would watch for the shepherd to be returning. In fact, some of those in the town that hadn't been out with the sheep all day, that maybe it was a rotating schedule sort of thing, and that was their quote-unquote day off, they would actually go out and help the shepherd that was look for the sheep so that they could have the best chance of finding that sheep in good condition. So it was often there were communal shepherds, but quite honestly, it was also communal celebration as well. Upon the successful return of the shepherd with the sheep, everyone joined in the celebration. Everyone joined in the party because the lost sheep was found. And that was what was the most important thing. Now, the main lesson of the parable is, of course, that Jesus, as the Good Shepherd, is always looking out for us. We might wander away, but He's going to go and look for us and find us and bring us back. But there are other lessons that are not quite as obvious as that one that we must learn. One I just mentioned, from the idea of the communal shepherds and how they all would take turns watching the sheep, and if one of the sheep had wandered off and one shepherd didn't come back, they might go back out with him and look. See, just as Jesus is constantly out looking for lost sheep, we need to be constantly out looking for lost sheep as well. We need to be out looking for people who maybe they even think that they've got it figured out, but they really don't. We need to be looking for people who are searching, those seekers, if you will, those that they know that there is a God and they want to worship God, but they're just not real sure how you're supposed to do it. So how are you doing in your search for lost sheep? Are you even searching for lost sheep? See, if we're going to be faithful to our shepherd, to our chief shepherd, to Jesus, we've got to be in the business of rescuing his sheep from danger. And there is danger. There's danger of an eternity that is more painful than you or I or they or anyone else could possibly imagine. But it's so simple to take them from that and change that to an eternity of more joy than anyone can possibly imagine. So what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for to be more evangelistic? What are you waiting for to be more of a person who's going to reach out to the lost in our community here in Siloam Springs, Arkansas? What are you waiting for to be one of those people who's going to do more to reach out to the lost people of Northwest Arkansas, of the state of Arkansas, of the United States, of the world? Why do you wait? Because, see, waiting can lead to disaster. So don't take that chance. If things aren't right between you and God this evening, make them right. Maybe that means you need to privately recommit yourself to God, that say, hey, God, I want to be a soul winner for you. I want to be looking for your lost sheep that are in this community and in this state and in this world. Or maybe that requires something more public. Whatever it takes to make things right between you and God, don't leave here before you take that step. And if that involves a public response, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?